On behalf of Calvin College and the Paul B. Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics, I wish to welcome you to this evening's address. I'm Corwin Smith, Director of the Henry Institute. The Henry Institute was created in 1997 to continue the work of integrating Christian faith and politics, an effort that was clearly evident in the life and work of educator and public servant Paul Henry. One of the activities of the Institute is its annual Paul Henry Lecture, and tonight marks the 11th such lecture. We thank you for your interest in tonight's address and for your presence here. We trust you will find the evening to be a stimulating and hopefully an enjoyable time together. Following tonight's lecture, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and then at the conclusion of the discussion, you're all invited to attend the reception that will be held in the lobby of the auditorium. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, would you please join with me in a word of prayer? Our gracious and sovereign God, we praise you for your creation, your faithfulness to us, and for the mercy you have shown us. We acknowledge our dependence upon you, and we gather this evening seeking to be faithful servants in your kingdom work. We ask for your leading and direction, as well as insight and discernment as we endeavor to fulfill our public responsibilities. We thank you for the life of Paul Henry, for his Christian convictions, his passion for justice, and we're grateful, too, for the work and witness of our speaker, Judge Michael McConnell. As you have instructed us, we pray for those who are entrusted to rule over us. We pray that you will provide them with discernment and wisdom as they confront the many complex and contentious issues that are brought before them. Enable them to balance rightfully and skillfully the demands of their principles and convictions with the needs to find solutions that can be achieved. We thank you we live in a country where we're free to express our political opinions, where we have the right to assemble both religiously and politically, and where we're free to cast our votes for candidates for public office. We ask that you would enable us to be your faithful servants. Help us to seek justice, to act with mercy, to walk humbly, and to bear witness to your name in both word and deed. Bless us all to your service. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, it is a personal pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Judge Michael McConnell, Federal Appellate Judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals, the 10th Circuit. Judge McConnell received his bachelor's degree from Michigan State University in 1976 and his Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from the University of Chicago Law School in 1979. Upon his graduation from law school, he served first as a law clerk in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, and then as a law clerk to Associate Justice William Brennan of the Supreme Court of the United States. After his service as a law clerk, Judge McConnell served as Assistant General Counsel in the Office of Management and Budget, and then as Assistant to the Solicitor General, the U.S. Department of Justice. In 1985, he joined the faculty of the University of Chicago Law School, and 12 years later, he moved to join the University of Utah College of Law. In 2002, Judge McConnell was appointed by President George W. Bush to the U.S. Court of Appeals and was confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate. Judge McConnell is widely known for his judicial opinions related to church-state issues, and he's among the country's most distinguished scholars in the field of constitutional law and theory, particularly with regard to the religion clauses of the First Amendment. The topic of Judge McConnell's address this evening is Public Virtue, Republican Government, and the Separation of Church and State. So would you please join with me in welcoming Judge McConnell to Calvin's campus.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I appreciate those of you who've braved the early winter of Western Michigan to come out to here. Having been an undergraduate at the behemoth sister institution a little bit to the east of here. I know what Michigan winters are like, and so I appreciate your coming out. It's a particular honor also to be here at Calvin College and to be asked to deliver the Paul Henry lecture. He was a great man and an inspiration to many of us. I'm going to be talking tonight mostly about a little history, but it's also a topic that's on our minds today and on the minds of many of our fellow citizens, having to do with the relationship between religion and liberal democracy. There's a kind of a conventional wisdom that you hear very frequently. It goes something like this, that the creation of a liberal democratic order required or presupposed a secular civic culture, that is, one in which religion has no public role. It may have an important private role for individuals and families and private institutions, but no public role, and that this secular public culture, this idea of secularization, is embodied in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, which protects the private practice of government, but also, it is said, protects government from the divisive and irrational powers of religion. It's necessary, according to this view, to base public policy and public affairs on the neutral ground of reason, rather than the superstitious sway of priests and bishops or the fulminations of fundamentalists. Now, some version of this position can be recognized in the reaction of many, especially in the blue states, to the fact that in the 2004 presidential election, many millions of Americans voted, at least partly, on the basis of religiously informed moral values rather than on their supposed self-interest in such things as prescription drugs, jobs, and health care. To many, this religious intrusion into politics is an offense against their cherished ideal of a secular public sphere. They speak darkly of betraying the principles of the founding and of dismantling the wall of separation created by the founders. On the other side, one hears similar rhetoric of an opposite nature, saying this is, or at least it should be, a Christian nation, and claiming that the wall of separation is some kind of a conspiracy or a coordinated assault against religion in America. Now, obviously, the rhetoric is overblown on both sides, but there's a good thing about this discussion, which is that it has rekindled interest in a very old and very interesting question, the role of religion in a democratic republic. And my point this evening is that the view of this issue at the founding was quite different from ours today, and in many ways much more interesting. Now, to begin with, contrary to popular belief, the First Amendment did not bring about an end to established religion in America. Although it forbade creation of a religious establishment at the national level, it left state establishments in place. The First Amendment does not apply to state governments. It provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It wasn't until after the 14th Amendment, and even then after the Supreme Court's incorporation of the Bill of Rights, or most of it, against the states in the 20th century, that religious establishments at the state level became deemed to be unconstitutional. And in fact, far from our founding, far from being against the idea of religious establishments, at the time the First Amendment was ratified, about half the states had some form of religious establishment, and in several more there were proposals for religious establishments that were only narrowly defeated. In fact, the 1780s were a time of renewed interest in and support for state religious establishments. And thus, in order to talk about this subject, we have to talk about what the arguments were in favor of an establishment of religion. Why was it that so many patriotic Republican Americans, including among them Adams, Washington, Patrick Henry, John Marshall, many others, why would they support an establishment of religion, something that seems to us self-evidently contrary to the liberal democratic order? Now, I hasten to add that I'm not suggesting the reasons in favor of the establishment because I support it. I don't. But in order to understand the principles behind a rejection of establishmentarianism, we have to know what it was that was being proposed, why it seemed attractive. And so there was essentially a three-step argument in favor of establishments of religion. The first step was that republican government, meaning rule by the people, required an extraordinary degree of public virtue. Second step, that religion was necessary, or at least highly conducive to the formation of public virtue. And third, that government support was necessary, or at least valuable, to support religion. Each of these steps is obviously very controversial today. Each of them was at least somewhat controversial at the time. So let's unpack them and talk about them one at a time. Step one is the relationship between republicanism and public virtue. Gordon Wood, probably the most significant and profound of our historians of the intellectual thought at the time of the founding, said, and I quote, "The 18th century mind was thoroughly convinced that a popularly based government cannot be supported without virtue." Now, there is such a wealth of evidence in support of this that I couldn't begin to scratch the surface. To read the political documents and speeches and sermons and ideas of people around the founding, you simply cannot miss it. Just a couple of examples. Washington said, and I quote, "It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government." Adams said, "Religion and virtue are the only foundations of republicanism and of all free government." Now, in order for this to make any sense, we have to talk about what they meant by virtue, because virtue is one of these many words in the political or philosophical vocabulary of the 18th century, which has taken on a quite different meaning, or at least connotation, for us today. Today, we think the idea of virtue has a kind of a prissy feel to it. To be virtuous is to be a prig. It's to behave the way your grandmother might want you to behave. It's especially associated with sexual chastity. That is not at all the way the word virtue was understood at the time of the founding. The word comes from the Latin word meaning manly, and thus, with apologies to feminist sensibilities, virtue meant manliness. It meant strength. It meant courage. Above all, it meant public spiritedness, which is the subordination of the self, obedience to the laws, and the willingness to sacrifice for the public good. Now, the connection between virtue and free government may seem surprising to those of us who associate republics with an untrammeled view of individual freedom. Our slogan today is, "If it feels good, do it." It seems odd to say that there's any special need or association between republicanism, which is free government, and virtue. And indeed, at a more philosophical level, think, for example, here of John Rawls and Rawlsian liberalism, it is very widely thought that a liberal republic must be neutral among competing conceptions of the good. Well, if a liberal regime cannot make any particular understanding of virtue its official orthodoxy, and hence therefore could not promote virtue, and certainly could not depend upon it or presuppose it. And thus, from a 21st century point of view, this idea that there is a necessary connection between virtue and republicanism seems to us, I think, a little odd. So here's the theory. The theory was that in monarchies, and we might extend this to mean any kinds of authoritarian government, people can be forced to obey through punishments and the apparatus of coercion, police, prisons, executions, standing armies, and so forth. Republics are different. Republicanism was not just a theory about selecting officials through elections, but about being a free person. It meant obedience to the law through the freely given consent of the governed, and not through coercion from above. Gordon Wood again, quote, "In a monarchy, each man's desire to do what was right in his own eyes could be restrained by fear or force. In a republic, however, each man must somehow be persuaded to submerge his public wants to the greater good of the whole." This meant that republics, more than other regimes, required public virtue. And that meant that Republican societies had to concern themselves with the character and the upbringing of their citizens. They could not be neutral among competing theories of the good. Now, there is and there was a contrary view. Jefferson put it very well when he said, and I quote, "It is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. Rather than try to mold good citizens, leave them alone and punish them if they misbehave." Now, there were two things wrong with this from a Republican perspective. First, the obligations of a good citizen go beyond the prohibitions of the criminal law. We care as a society about such things as generosity, kindness, patriotism, participation in public affairs. Public virtue should not and cannot be reduced to mere legal compulsion. And then second, Jefferson's republic is a republic of coercion, of force and punishment. Reflect on this. According to the most recent numbers that I have at hand, 2,078,570 people are in prison in the United States today. In 2003, 3.2% of the adult population were on probation, in jail, or in prison. There's something wrong, or at least odd, about a government of free people in which so many of us are in jail. A Republican would say that it might be that a little bit more attention to the inculcation of virtue would spare us some of that. Which brings us to the second step, the connection between public virtue and religion. This may be even more controversial. I mean, after all, we all know people who are virtuous without being religious. And the opposite. We know people who are conspicuously religious but are not virtuous. We may even have seen some of them on TV. In its more extreme form, it's often said that religion is deleterious to liberal democratic society because of it's prone to extremism and intolerance. People say that it is better to base our judgments on science and reason rather than on religion. But the founding, however, there was widespread agreement about this connection between virtue and religion. And let's look at that. Again, I want to begin with Washington. In his farewell address, he said, this is a little bit long, but it's such a significant quotation that I want to share it with you. Washington said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity," and note here his term, political prosperity, he's talking about the well-being of the nation as a political entity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The firmest props of the duties of men and citizens, religion and morality. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of a peculiar structure, I love the way he puts that. Here he's talking about the very few people who might be able to be educated into some kind of a philosophy that would be a substitute. Reason and experience, he says, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. And by the way, Washington was not a particularly religious man. Why would he say such a thing? Well, in the 18th century, Churches were the principal, almost the only institutions for the inculcation of public virtue. There were no public schools. Few people attended college. The colleges that did exist were almost exclusively under religious auspices. There was no television, there were no radio to spread ideas. Ministers, along with lawyers and doctors, were the only learned professions, and often the only people with the opportunity to study and expound upon ethical questions. It's estimated that about 80% of the published political pamphlets in the 1770s were reprints of sermons. Historian Harry Stout has estimated that New England churchgoers would have heard over 15,000 hours of sermons over a lifetime. To put that in perspective, that compares to about 1,500 hours of lectures in a 4-year college education. That has an impact. And so religion and the institutions of religion may very well have seemed, it's not surprising that Washington deemed that to be an indispensable supports. And moreover, when you have an understanding of public virtue as meaning voluntary self-sacrifice for the public good, think of the connection of that between that and the teachings of biblical Christianity. Perhaps the most common ethical theme of biblical religion is the condemnation of selfishness. Love God and your neighbor as yourself. So, this is mostly about history, but we must wonder, is this plausible today? What about the connection between religion and public virtue? Well, what about churches as institutions? Where else do people go regularly today, weekly, and sometimes more often, to discuss right and wrong, loving their neighbor, and so forth? Where else do we go for conversation about that? And there's also a wealth of social science data on this subject. I've looked at many of these studies. I will freely confess to you that I'm a little suspicious of the methodology of many of these. I don't place any great weight on them, but there are lots of them, and the results are suggestive that religious participation does seem to correlate with a number of indications of socially responsible behavior, such as among teenagers, lower drug use, crime, cheating, and adolescent sex, and among adults, higher levels of voting and civic participation, and greater likelihood to engage in charitable activity. I also have an experience I want to share with you that happened a couple of years ago when I was first came on the bench. I went off to what we call Baby Judges School, and in the course of Baby Judges School, we did a tour of a medium security federal prison. And at the end of this tour, we had a candid discussion with the warden. So we sat around a table, and the warden came in, and we could ask the warden almost anything. This warden was quite a character. He was like something out of central casting for a prison warden. This was the 5th prison he had been at. He was brought into this one because there was some incipient rise of gang activity, and he was the man to bring a halt to that. He was hard-bitten and unsentimental. And so we were talking about various things. This prison was chosen for us as for our tour because it was had a particularly good reputation for having strong educational programs, vocational training, vocational opportunities, and substance abuse programs. So we're sitting around there, and one of my colleagues asked, are there any programs or any indication about what works in terms of recidivism? Recidivism being the rate at which someone, after being released from prison, commits another crime and returns. And the warden paused for a moment, and he said, and I was so struck by this that I went back to my room and I wrote it down. So this is just about a verbatim quote. He said, "The only objective, measurable connection between what happens in prison and the recidivism rate is a religious conversion experience. For those inmates, you can tell the difference." Now, I'm not asking you to believe this, just to understand why the connection between religion and public virtue may not be so far-fetched even today. Which brings us to the third step. If republics require public virtue, and if religion is required for, or at least conducive to public virtue, it seems to follow that the government should provide some sort of support for religion. That isn't such a surprising conclusion. What do we always do when we want to support something? If we want to have more messages or encouraging kids not to smoke, we appropriate money to have an anti-smoking campaign. Right? If we want to support the arts, we create the National Endowment for the Arts. Right? If you want to support religion, it seemed only natural to propose some sort of support for religion, and indeed, that's exactly what was done in 4 states of the Union at the time of the founding. Basically, although there were many differences of detail, the basic scheme went something like this, that everyone was required to contribute to, and maybe even in some states to attend, worship services, but they had a certain degree of choice as to which ones they would go to. Not complete choice, but constrained choice. And so basically you could choose what denomination you wanted to support and attend, but you had to support and attend something, right? Now, 4 states had a system along these lines. 2 other states authorized such a system in their state constitutions but never implemented it, and 4 others debated creating such a system but did not adopt it by various votes. So this is a very lively public policy proposal at the time of adoption of the First Amendment. Now, gradually, after the Constitution was adopted, the 4 states that had such a system repealed it. Not as a matter of federal constitutional law, because the First Amendment didn't apply to the states, but they repealed it for their own reasons. The last to go, which was Massachusetts, repealed its system in 1833. It was this process, rather than the adoption of the First Amendment Establishment Clause, which constituted the disestablishment of religion in America. And the question is, why did they do it? First thing to notice is that the greatest part of the political support for disestablishment of religion did not come from the secular Enlightenment or from secular intellectuals or from anyone who was hostile to religion. There were a few of those, but the real storm troops of opposition to the establishment came from the most intensely evangelical elements of American society, most of all the Baptists. Now, to be sure, some of the denominations in America were accustomed to established churches and tended to make peace with them. The Anglicans were, of course, the established church from England. The Presbyterians have been the established church in Scotland. Lutherans, primarily in Pennsylvania, were quite comfortable with establishment, as were the Methodists. But the denominations and congregations that were outgrowths of the Great Awakening tended to oppose, and especially the Baptists. And they opposed for distinctly, not surprisingly, for religious reasons. Let's look at what those religious reasons were for fighting against establishments of religion. First, begin with the religious idea of freedom of conscience. Conscience being the duty, hence the right, of every person to worship God in the manner dictated by his own conscience and conviction. Now, this idea goes back at least to St. Thomas Aquinas, but it really came to fore in the Protestant Reformation. Remember the slogan of the Reformation, God alone is Lord of the conscience. The idea here is that each believer has unmediated access to the divine through prayer and scripture. We do not have to rely upon priests or on the teaching authority of the church. This is what made Protestants different from Catholics. Their belief in the priesthood of all believers, their personal relationship to God, not mediated through the teaching authority of the church, the Virgin Mary, saints, priests, confessors, bishops, or popes. Now, it wasn't recognized fully at first, but this same logic applied not only to the Pope, but to the state. An establishment of religion is useless because only genuine faith, a voluntary submission to the will of God, is true religion. And it's worse than useless. It's idolatrous, because an establishment of religion sets up some authority other than the Bible as the authority for the faith. Neither the Pope in Rome nor the legislature in Lansing has any authority to dictate to us in matters of religion. One advocate of disestablishment, a Baptist leader in Massachusetts, put it this way, quote, "Nothing can be true religion but a voluntary obedience under God's revealed will." Now this essentially theological idea found its way into documents that we think of as being secular foundations of constitutional freedoms. Jefferson's Bill for Religious Freedom, which was adopted in Virginia in 1786, begins this way, and I quote, "Well aware that Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens, or by civil incapacitations, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion," and so forth. And it goes on to provide for disestablishment of religion in Virginia. It's interesting, isn't it, that Jefferson's disestablishment bill begins with a theological proposition. Almighty God hath created the mind free, and it proceeds to make an appeal to what Jefferson calls the, quote, "teachings of the holy author of our religion." So that's the first of the religious reasons, the religious attack on establishment of religion. The second had to do with the autonomy of the church, what was often called the freedom of the church. Now, we usually think today of establishment as theocracy. In fact, there's a popular book out today with that in its title, Theocracy, right? But in practice, establishment of religion was the other way around. The government controlled the church and used it for its own purposes. In 1789, every American knew what an establishment of religion was. Most had experienced it firsthand. It was a legal arrangement like the Church of England, which is described in the parliamentary statutes as, quote, "the church by law established." So let's look. What was the Church of England establishment like? Well, first of all, in the Act of Supremacy, passed originally under Henry VIII and reaffirmed numerous times, the king, the monarch, was head of the church. What about the Bible? We're all familiar with what we usually call the King James Bible. Well, its official title is the Authorized Version. Who authorized it? Well, King James authorized it, but especially it was authorized by a statute passed by Parliament. The Book of Common Prayer was adopted by an act of Parliament. The 39 Articles of Faith in the Anglican Church were an act of Parliament, and one of them proclaimed the king's authority, both spiritual and temporal. And in fact, the canons of the church required ministers 4 times a year to preach sermons specifically on the duty of all Christians to be in submission to royal authority. The Archbishop of Canterbury was and still is appointed by the government. In this tradition, the establishment of religion, the government controlled the church. Now, the dissenting tradition, epitomized by the Puritans and later the Great Awakening, broke from this tradition. Jonathan Edwards, who was the greatest of the theologian preachers of the movement, extolled the dignity of the church as the eternal city of God. He said that the church was governed entirely by divine ordinance and was utterly exempt from worldly authority. Now, the Baptists took this even further. They argued that not only should the church not be subject to the direct control of the state, but it should not receive state money because this would subject the church to government influence. A memorial in 1776 from the Virginia Association of Baptists was as follows: "If, therefore, the state provides a support for preachers of the gospel and they receive it in consideration of their services, they must certainly, when they preach, act as officers of the state and ought to be accountable thereto for their conduct, not only as members of civil society, but also as preachers. He who pays the piper picks the tune. And so the second line of attack on establishment of religion was that it would lead to government control over the church, and that was inconsistent with the ecclesiology coming out of the Protestant dissenting tradition. And the third religious argument was a slightly more pragmatic argument, and it had to do with the weakening of religion. The question is, does government support really help? And experience shows that when the government runs something, it's usually done poorly. If you like the United States Postal Service, or if you really admire the performance of FEMA in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, you'd probably like an established church. The government doesn't do a very good job of it. In fact, I find this quite amusing, but David Hume, the great historian and philosopher of the period just immediately prior to the founding, he believed that enthusiastic religion was a danger to the state. And therefore, Hume was a supporter of the established church in England, precisely because he thought that the establishment would dampen the enthusiasm of the ministers and make them less dangerous. This theory is spelled out in some detail in a chapter in Adam Smith's Inquiry into the Causes of the Wealth of Nations, the very foundational document of the science of economics. And he has this chapter about the economics of establishments of religion. And I'll just read you a short passage from it. Smith wrote, "The teachers of religious doctrine may depend altogether for their subsistence upon the voluntary contributions of their hearers, or they may derive it from some other fund to which the law of their country may entitle them." In other words, you can either have voluntary contributions or you can have support from the state. Their exertion, their zeal and industry are likely to be much greater in the former situation than in the latter. He described the clergy of the established churches as, quote, reposing themselves upon their benefices and neglecting to keep up the fervor of faith and devotion in the great body of the people. And he said that they had given themselves up to indolence. Think about this. Which members of the clergy have a greater incentive to bring in new members and to get the congregation excited? Is it the minister who receives a regular stipend from the state? Or is it the minister who depends for his salary on passing the collection plate on Sunday morning? The Baptists in the United States at this time described the ministers of the established church as, quote, hireling priests. Right? And so there were other arguments too, but these were the three most important arguments against the establishment of religion. Inconsistency with freedom of conscience, a threat to the autonomy, the freedom of the church, and the weakening of religion. And these arguments carried the day. Not that religion is deleterious to liberal government, but that governmental support and control are bad for religion. Now, it took a while for these arguments to prevail. The last state to do away with an establishment was Massachusetts in 1833. And that's not surprising either, because disestablishment admittedly appeared risky. If you believe the first step in the argument, and virtually everybody did believe it, that republics depend upon public virtue, well, we might be able to reduce the need for public virtue, but we weren't going to be able to do away with it. And if you believe the second step, that virtue requires religion, and again, maybe we can come up with a few other secular alternatives for minds of a peculiar character, as Washington put it, but nothing has ever appeared that quite does the trick. So if you believe those first two arguments, it requires courage to say that our new republic will simply leave religion alone. What you have to realize is that disestablishment was not proposed as a departure from this three-step argument. It was a solution to the third step. How can we support religion without hurting it? By interfering with conscience, destroying the independence of the church, and weakening incentives. Religion, the founders thought, would flourish better if left free. Just as free enterprise is good for the economy, free exercise is good for religion. And the remarkable thing is that it seems to have worked. The United States is still one of the most religious countries in the world, far more so in terms of the basic sociological measurements of religious participation than the countries of Europe, which retained their desiccated religious establishments. In the 1830s, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville toured the United States and was amazed by the high degree of religiosity he observed. He wrote, and I quote, "America is still the place where the Christian religion has kept the greatest real power over men's souls, and nothing better demonstrates how useful and natural it is to man, since the country where it has now the widest sway is also the most enlightened and the freest." He explained that religion never interfered directly in the government of the American state, but that it must nevertheless be considered as the, quote, "first of their political institutions." As he traveled around the country, Tocqueville reported that he asked clergy of every denomination, "Why is it that religion is so powerful in the United States?" They all gave the same answer, and the answer they gave was the separation of church and state. So, if this is true, we're left with a happy, optimistic conclusion. It wasn't necessary to choose between religion, public virtue, and disestablishment. You could have all three. Now, because this is a subject of tremendous possible misunderstanding, I'd like to end by telling you some things that I have not said, do not believe, and hope that you don't take away from this. First, I did not say and do not believe that all religions are good. To say that religion should be free and that this will promote civic happiness, political prosperity in Washington's language, does not mean that all exercises of that freedom are virtuous or admirable, any more than a belief in the truth promotion function of free speech means that all speech is true or truthful or good. Looking at American history, religion has sometimes been a force for good, sometimes has been a force for very great evil. It's a mixed bag, just like everything else. But on balance, I do believe that freedom of religion has had beneficial civic effects, and that's the point. Second, the second thing that I'm not saying is I'm not saying that non-religious philosophies are inferior or that they do not contribute to the public good. They do. They're part of us as well. I have not said and do not believe that there's anything wrong with or inferior in non-religious ways of thinking about and promoting virtue. My point is just that our constitutional tradition, contrary to the conventional wisdom, does not favor the secular over the religious. That religion has a public and not just a private role to play, and that non-establishment was defended at the founding as good for religion, hence good for virtue, and hence good for liberal democracy. Thank you. These Klieg lights up here make it a Right. So the question is, what about various indirect forms of support for religion? And is there anything in the history, or I guess the thinking coming out of the history that bears on that? There was not a great deal direct discussion of this question. Certainly, tax benefits, tax exemptions for religious institutions were already known at the time, and were not generally regarded as establishments of religion. So, for example, in the states that disestablished religion, tax-exempt status for religious properties remained in place, which is pretty good evidence that they did not regard that as an establishment. So let me retreat to a slightly higher level of generality and sort of reflect on how the ideas might come into play. Part of the question is, what do we mean by indirect aid to religion? It is literally impossible to imagine a world in which there was not very substantial indirect support for religion. For example, when you drive to church on Sunday morning, you're riding on roads. Those roads are provided for all sorts of uses, including that, and you can't really imagine. I mean, if there were a rule that you could not use government-subsidized roads in order to drive to church, it would be functionally equivalent to saying you can't go to church. I mean, and that's really a government support for the general infrastructure of society is so pervasive that it is literally impossible to imagine complete prohibition on all aid to religion, no matter how widespread it may be. Where police and fire protection and use of the roads and the mails, and there's just an endless list that the most supposedly strict separationist would not bring suit against. So there's indirect in that sense. So maybe we mean by indirect something like non-discriminatory, right? So that would mean aid that goes to churches, but churches only as part of a broad category of other similar recipients. And here it becomes a little bit more controversial because, in fact, most, if not all, financial aid provided to religious institutions is pursuant to such a thing. Tax-exempt status is not reserved for churches. There are a few, but surprisingly few, religion-specific exemptions in the tax code. There was an article, and there's been a series of articles in the New York Times recently, quite inaccurate in many respects, but there was one about tax exemptions, and they identified. They made it sound as though there were quite a few, but in fact, if you look at it, there are relatively few religion-specific tax exemptions. Then there's such things as, well, what about aid to schools? If we're going to provide aid to, let's say, college students to go to college through Pell Grants or something like that, should they be able to use their Pell Grants to attend, not to be invidious, Calvin College or Notre Dame or BYU, right? And that's an interesting question. It has been answered from the very beginning and upheld by a few lower courts to say yes, that it is not aid to religion to allow college students to choose where they're going to use their Pell Grants. And similar logic has quite recently been applied by the Supreme Court to vouchers for elementary and secondary schools. There's nothing in the founding that I think really speaks directly about this, but again, it would seem it's one thing to say that the government, when the government is not supporting any kind of education, that it shouldn't be giving money to religious schools. It's another thing when the government becomes in the business of subsidizing people to go to school to say that well, secular schools can get it, but religious schools cannot. So those are the main areas that constitutional law is concerned with today. And the Supreme Court has, again, quite recently moved, I think, quite emphatically in the direction of saying that so long as the aid is is genuinely neutral in character, and is provided for secular reasons, not because the recipient is religious, but because it's providing the same kinds of services that comparable non-religious organizations are providing, that it is constitutional. Yes. I mean, this is quite a vexing problem. This is an issue of tax law, first of all. It's not, I mean, I want to analyze this more as a lawyer than this talk is more of a historical nature. But to look at this question in a strictly legal point of view, this is a question of tax law. In Section 501C of the Internal Revenue Code, there are various categories of nonprofit organization. Religious organizations are among them, but they are not the only ones. There are a wide range of such organizations. All of these organizations are forbidden to engage in grassroots lobbying. Now, publication of voting records may or may not come within that category. I'm a little surprised to hear that Jerry Falwell's organization has been cut off because of that. A number of nonprofit organizations publish, these ostensibly educational lists. I mean, who's to say that it's biased? I mean, everything is biased in a sense, but the Sierra Club and any number of other nonprofits educate the public about how congressmen and senators vote without necessarily crossing this highly difficult line into grassroots lobbying. But putting that aside for a moment, the 501c4 allows nonprofit organizations to establish separate affiliates to engage in lobbying. These 501c4 organizations are tax exempt in the sense that their profits are not taxed, but they are not eligible for people to make tax exempt contributions. And 501c4 organizations can share boards of directors with a 501c3, and this is the way most of the large sort of ideological organizations operate, is that they have, they wear the same hats, but they have a nonprofit entity to which you can deduct your contributions, and then they have this political affiliate to which you may not deduct your contributions, and then they do both. Churches are, in theory, eligible for that, but the problem is that from a point of view of ecclesiology, the pastor doesn't usually wear both hats. And in fact, it is said, I'm no expert on ecclesiology, but within a number of denominations, the Catholic Church, for example, it is inconsistent with their self-understanding of their institutional structure to say that there is a sort of separate affiliate. You have the bishop, and he speaks for the church on all matters, right? You don't have the bishop's political affiliate. He can't, when he goes in the pulpit or speaks for the church on politically controversial matters, he can't wear a separate hat. And that's why churches are particularly pinched by the tax code and make the argument that their freedom of speech is being interfered with. They are formally under the same rules that the Sierra Club I don't mean to pick on the Sierra Club, but they just come to mind as one other nonprofit entity that engages in political activity. They're formally under the same set of rules, but because of the nature of the church, it doesn't work for them, and that's really what the problem is. we were to look to the history of the founding about this, is there anything wrong with, is there something inconsistent with the separation of church and state from ministers and churches to endorse candidates or participate actively in politics? This is one of the easiest questions anyone from the floor could have asked. The answer is obviously not, because at the time of the founding this was extremely common. In fact, quick story. James Madison, during the ratification controversy, supported ratification of the Constitution and defended against the claim that there was the charge, the complaint, that there was no Bill of Rights. He then is running for Congress in the very first congressional election in 1788, and his enemies control the legislature, and he's thrown into a district in Western Virginia in which there is an anti-federalist majority, and his opponent, interestingly enough, was James Monroe, who later becomes his right-hand man. But at the time, Monroe and Madison are on opposite sides of the aisle, and Madison is being opposed by the Baptists, who are very numerous in this anti-federalist dominated district. He's opposed because of the fact that he had made these arguments against having a Bill of Rights. And so Madison writes a letter to the Reverend George Eve of the, I believe it's called the Blue Run Baptist Church, in which he pledges his support for full protection in the Constitution for the rights of, for freedom of religion, whereupon the Reverend Eve calls a rally at the Blue Run Baptist Church. Hundreds of people attend, and Reverend Eve, there's an eyewitness account of this event in which Reverend Eve, it says in the eyewitness account, spoke long, capitalized. And if you've ever know any Baptist preachers, you'll know what spoke long means. Spoke long in support of Madison for the seat, and he was in fact elected. Right? And so here we are, the principal author of the First Amendment got into his seat because of an endorsement by a Baptist minister, and we might well not even have a Bill of Rights or the First Amendment had not the Baptist Church exercised what was then its freedom of speech to engage in political activity on behalf of James Madison. So there we are. Other questions? Yes. Certainly we've had the chaplaincy from the very beginning, and indeed in a sense since before the beginning, because the Continental Congress provided for chaplains in the Revolutionary Army before we had even won our independence, and we've had chaplains in the military ever since. This has been challenged in court, although not often. The leading case on this came out of the Second Circuit, and the reasoning as to why this was a legitimate thing to provide the chaplains is really quite similar to what you say in your question. The argument is that when we send men and women into exotic locales and far from their homes, that we need to provide an opportunity for them to be able to engage in worship. Were we not to do that, that would be a denial of their free exercise of religion. And I think particularly of, for example, of soldiers stationed in places like Saudi Arabia, where if there's not going to be a chaplain on the base, there's no opportunity for non-Islamic worship at all. Now, can that principle be extended to domestic institutions? I believe it has been argued in the case of the very few public boarding schools that exist, and it has been upheld in the case of some foster care type of things. I'm not sure that the argument has ever actually been made with respect to ordinary, grade 1 through grade 12 elementary and secondary education. And I think the distinction, if there is one, is that school only lasts, it seems like it lasts all day, but in reality, it only lasts, 6 or 7 hours, and that is not quite the same thing as being off in Saudi Arabia, that you're not, in fact, cut off from the opportunity of worship. You can still go to church on Sunday. You can attend Jewish education classes or CCD classes in the afternoon, as many people do. The court has also upheld release time programs in which religions provide religious training, even during the course of the day, and children are released to go to that, but not chaplains within the schools. That might be because it's not thought to be really necessary for free exercise. It might be because there's a problem in choosing who those chaplains are, and we certainly have a fear. And as a parent, I would have the fear that the government chosen chaplains to lead my children and direct my children's religious education might not be my cup of tea. It seems very likely that such people would end up teaching a rather watered down and inoffensive and therefore largely meaningless brand of nominal religion. And since I think that is watered down nominal religion is probably the most powerful and pernicious religious force in America, it's not something I would particularly welcome for my children. Yes.
Historically, you explained that the third reason for the disestablishment of religion that was given was that it would weaken religion and the church would take over the church. And I was just wondering your personal opinion, apart from what the law or the First Amendment says or what you might believe it ought to say, would you warn institutions like Calvin or K-12 faith-based schools or faith-based drug rehabilitation programs or student newspapers at a university that there's a danger in their accepting government funding in that government might start to take them over and dictate to them in ways that they would not want?
That's a very good question. The question is, wholly apart from constitutional doctrine, would I warn religious institutions against taking government money when they're operating, say, drug rehabilitation programs or Calvin College or whatever ministries that they may be engaged in that are eligible for government funding? So here, the answer to that is I certainly think there's a danger. If I were counseling my own religious denomination about this, I think my practical answer would be, it all depends. I think this is something where you have to look at the details. There are some programs some types of ministry and some types of government program that are sufficiently objective in their criteria that I think that the dangers are not non-existent, but tolerable. Take, for example, the issue of Pell Grants. The only major forms of federal regulation that attach to the college as a result of the students' acceptance of Pell Grants have to do with discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin, age, and disability. Now, there may be religious organizations for which that is a problem. I don't think any that my denomination would be affiliated with would have any difficulty fully complying with that, and so I would go with that. It all depends on how intrusive the government is going to be. And let me just add this other thought. It is not as if by turning down the government's nickel, religious institutions become free of government interference. Take, for example, high schools. Right? It might be that if they received, if religiously affiliated high schools receive funds, that there'll be some additional forms of regulation, but they are already subject to quite intrusive regulation in the form of whatever state certification requirements there are. Religiously affiliated law schools have been bludgeoned over some issues such as whether they allow recruiting on campus for organizations that don't that discriminate on the basis of sexuality. And that's without any money going to them. So, I mean, these are very hard questions, and I just don't think that you can say a categorical yes or a categorical no. I would look at the details. One final thought about that is that when the ideas of separation of church and state were being developed by people like John Locke, the government was understood to be very small. Right? The functions of government had to do largely with protection of one person from another against force and fraud, and protection against foreign enemies, and not a lot else. You know, when Locke was writing, there were no public schools, there were no public universities, there wasn't such a thing as the National Endowment for the Arts. All poor relief was administered by the churches. The religious side of the wall of separation was very large, and the government side was very small. Now, as the government begins to involve itself in so many things that it was never involved in before, funding of the arts, health care, education, and so forth, we're really left with two unpleasant choices from a point of view of religious autonomy. One is to keep the church independent, but at the price of being discriminated against and maybe even priced out of the market. Right? It's hard to imagine how religious hospitals, for example, could operate if they did not accept Medicare and Medicaid funding. It's almost impossible. There are a couple colleges that do it, but it's almost impossible for colleges to operate unless their students receive Pell Grants. So that's one alternative, is to cut yourself off at the expense of maybe even dying, right? And then the other alternative is to take the money with all of the various